Most people assume they want change. They imagine that if better habits, healthier emotions, stronger confidence, or more fulfilling relationships became available, they would naturally move toward them. But real psychological change is often resisted long before conscious reasoning fully understands why. The reason is not simply fear of effort or uncertainty. It is that the mind becomes deeply attached to familiarity, even when familiarity is painful. Repeated emotional states, repeated behaviors, repeated thought patterns, and repeated identity structures create psychological continuity. That continuity becomes stabilizing because the system learns how to predict it. Over time, familiar reactions begin feeling like part of the self. Once this happens, changing the pattern no longer feels like modifying behavior. It feels like threatening identity. This is why people often return to emotional states or habits they consciously want to escape. The system is not only pursuing pleasure, it is preserving familiarity. Familiar suffering can feel psychologically safer than unfamiliar stability because the nervous system already knows how to organize around it. Predictability reduces uncertainty, and the mind prioritizes predictability heavily. This creates a disturbing realization. Many people are not simply attached to specific behaviors. They are attached to remaining recognizable to themselves. Even painful emotional cycles can become stabilizing if they have been repeated long enough to form the structure of identity itself. The result is that the person unconsciously protects the very patterns they consciously claim to want to change, because those patterns maintain psychological continuity between past, present, and expected future experience. The mind does not experience repeated patterns as repetition forever. Eventually, repetition becomes normality. A thought repeated often enough stops feeling like a thought and starts feeling like perspective. An emotion repeated often enough stops feeling temporary and starts feeling like personality. A behavior repeated often enough stops feeling chosen and starts feeling automatic. This transformation matters because once a pattern becomes normal, the system stops evaluating it critically. Familiarity removes friction. The repeated state becomes the baseline against which everything else is measured. If anxiety has been repeated for years, calmness may begin feeling unnatural rather than desirable. If emotional chaos has been repeated long enough, stability may feel emotionally empty at first because the nervous system no longer associates calmness with familiarity. This creates a paradox where healthier states can initially feel psychologically wrong, simply because they are unfamiliar. The mind then interprets the discomfort of unfamiliarity as evidence that the change itself is incorrect. In reality, the discomfort is often the nervous system reacting to the loss of prediction certainty. The old pattern may have caused suffering, but it was known suffering. The new state lacks an established structure, and because the system equates familiarity with safety, it begins pulling attention, emotion, and behavior back toward the repeated identity it already understands how to maintain. Identity plays a central role in this attachment because the mind continuously organizes experience around maintaining a coherent sense of self. Every repeated pattern becomes integrated into self-perception over time. A person who repeatedly experiences rejection may begin organizing identity around being unwanted. A person who repeatedly experiences emotional instability may begin organizing identity around being broken. These patterns are not consciously selected as identities. They emerge gradually through emotional repetition and narrative reinforcement. Once integrated, however, the system begins protecting them automatically because identity stability becomes psychologically important. This is why contradictory experiences often fail to create immediate transformation. A confident moment rarely overrides years of repeated insecurity because the large identity structure already predicts how the person is supposed to feel. The contradictory experience is treated as temporary while the repeated pattern is treated as authentic. The mind trusts familiarity more than isolated evidence. Over time, The identity structure begins filtering perception itself, selecting interpretations that reinforce continuity while minimizing experiences that threaten it. This creates self-sustaining psychological systems where familiar emotional patterns continue reproducing themselves automatically because the identity structure depends on their repetition to remain stable. Emotional pain becomes especially difficult to leave when it has been repeated enough to create predictability. The nervous system adapts to repeated emotional environments regardless of whether those environments are healthy. A person repeatedly exposed to criticism becomes conditioned around vigilance and self-monitoring. A person repeatedly exposed to emotional inconsistency becomes conditioned around uncertainty and hyper-awareness. Over time, these states stop feeling reactive and start feeling normal. The body learns them, the mind predicts them. Future experiences are then interpreted through those familiar emotional expectations automatically. This means that people do not simply remember emotional pain. Their systems become organized around anticipating it, and once anticipation stabilizes, familiar emotional tension begins feeling psychologically coherent. Calmness or emotional safety can initially feel disorienting because the system no longer recognizes the environment emotionally. The absence of familiar tension may even create anxiety because the nervous system interprets unpredictability itself as potential danger. This is one reason people sometimes recreate painful dynamics unconsciously. The repeated emotional structure feels more psychologically organized than unfamiliar peace. The mind returns to what it understands how to predict, even when the prediction involves suffering. Habits reinforce this attachment because repeated behavior changes future expectation automatically. Every repeated action teaches the system what to anticipate from itself. A person who repeatedly procrastinates begins expecting avoidance before difficult tasks even appear. A person who repeatedly withdraws emotionally begins expecting disconnection automatically during vulnerability. These expectations alter future behavior before conscious intention fully engages. The nervous system prepares for familiar patterns because repeated behavior increases predictive certainty. Over time, the person no longer experiences the behavior as something they do occasionally. They experience it as part of who they are. This changes the emotional meaning of change itself. Breaking the pattern no longer feels like altering a behavior. It feels like stepping outside the identity the system has learned to recognize as familiar. And because identity continuity reduces uncertainty, the mind resists this disruption automatically. Even conscious motivation often fails against deeply repeated behavioral structures because the system is not merely protecting habits. It is protecting predictability about the self. Internal narration strengthens this attachment by repeatedly explaining familiar patterns in ways that make them feel inevitable. The mind continuously generates stories about why certain emotions, reactions, and behaviors occur. Over time, these stories stop functioning as interpretations and start functioning as identity confirmations. A person who repeatedly says internally, "This is just how I'm," gradually removes psychological distance between the pattern and the self. The behavior no longer appears conditional or adaptive. It appears fundamental. This matters because the system treats identity-based narratives differently from temporary experiences. Temporary experiences can change without threatening continuity. Identity narratives cannot shift as easily because they organize the structure of self-perception itself. Once a painful pattern becomes integrated into the story the mind uses to explain who you are, abandoning the pattern begins feeling psychologically disorienting. The nervous system loses a familiar organizing structure. This is why people sometimes defend behaviors or emotional states that are actively harming them. The pattern has become narratively intertwined with identity. Challenging the behavior now feels like challenging the self. The mind then automatically generates resistance in order to preserve coherence. That resistance rarely feels like self-protection. It feels like truth. The person believes the repeated pattern reflects something essential about who they are, because the narrative has been reinforced often enough to feel emotionally unquestionable. The body reinforces these identity structures physically through repeated nervous system activation. Emotional states are not only mental experiences. They involve physiological patterns that become increasingly familiar through repetition. Chronic stress alters baseline arousal. Repeated anxiety changes attentional readiness. Emotional suppression changes bodily regulation. Over time, the nervous system begins expecting these states automatically. Familiar chemistry becomes psychologically stabilizing because the body learns how to organize around it predictively. This creates a hidden layer of attachment. The person is not only attached to thoughts or behaviors, the body itself becomes conditioned toward familiar emotional activation patterns. Calmness may initially feel emotionally flat because the nervous system no longer associates low arousal with familiarity. Intensity becomes mistaken for aliveness simply because the body adapted to functioning within repeated stimulation. This is why people sometimes unconsciously recreate emotionally intense situations even while consciously desiring peace. The familiar physiological state feels more recognizable to the nervous system than unfamiliar regulation. The body then reinforces the identity structure by continuously pulling attention and emotional interpretation back toward states it has practiced repeatedly over time. Social environments deepen this attachment because people are often reinforced for remaining psychologically consistent. Others learn who you are through repeated patterns. They develop expectations about your reactions, personality, emotional style, and role within relationships. Once these expectations stabilize socially, change creates friction, not only internally but externally. People may respond differently when familiar behaviors disappear. Some relationships unconsciously depend on the continuation of specific identity patterns. A person attempting to become emotionally healthier may suddenly disrupt relational dynamics that were previously organized around insecurity, conflict, caretaking, or emotional dependence. This creates additional pressure to return to familiar behavior because the old identity structure maintained predictability both internally and socially. The person then experiences resistance from multiple directions at once. The nervous system seeks familiarity. The identity narrative seeks continuity. The social environment seeks consistency. All of these systems reinforce the repeated self simultaneously. This is why change can feel isolating even when it is beneficial. The existing identity was not only maintained internally, it was stabilized relationally through repeated interaction patterns reinforced over time. The reason this attachment remains mostly invisible is because the mind experiences familiarity as authenticity. Repeated patterns feel real precisely because they are repeated. The nervous system interprets ease of access as evidence of truth. Thoughts that appear automatically feel honest. Emotional reactions that emerge quickly feel genuine. Behaviors repeated for years feel natural. But naturalness is often just reinforced familiarity operating efficiently beneath awareness. The system becomes so practiced at reproducing the same emotional and behavioral structures that alternatives begin feeling artificial by comparison. This creates the illusion that the familiar identity represents the real self, while unfamiliar possibilities feel fake or forced. Yet the familiar self was also constructed gradually through repetition. It only feels authentic because the system has rehearsed it enough times to reduce resistance around it. The mind then mistakes low resistance for essential truth. This confusion is what keeps many people psychologically trapped inside repeated identities long after those identities stop serving them. They are not only attached to the emotional pattern, they are attached to the feeling that the pattern represents who they fundamentally are. This is why meaningful change often feels emotionally threatening even when it is consciously desired. The threat is not always the new behavior itself. The threat is the disruption of continuity. A different emotional response creates uncertainty about identity. A healthier pattern interrupts familiar prediction systems. A calmer internal state destabilizes emotional structures the nervous system has relied on for years. The person may consciously interpret this discomfort as evidence they are failing or becoming disconnected from themselves, but often the discomfort is simply the system reacting to unfamiliarity. The old identity structure expected repetition. The new pattern interrupts that expectation. For a period of time, the person exists between two psychological systems. The familiar identity no longer feels fully stable, while the unfamiliar identity has not yet become integrated enough to feel natural. This transitional state is deeply uncomfortable because the nervous system temporarily loses predictive certainty. And since the mind strongly prioritizes predictability, it continuously attempts to pull the person back toward the older repeated structure where coherence already exists. Repetition does not merely preserve identity, it narrows possibility over time. The more consistently a person returns to the same emotional reactions, behaviors, and interpretations, the less psychologically available alternative responses begin to feel. This narrowing happens gradually. At first, multiple responses may still feel possible, but repeated reinforcement strengthens certain pathways while weakening others through disuse. Eventually, the repeated pattern becomes the default response before conscious awareness fully recognizes that alternatives existed. This is how identity structures begin limiting perception itself. A person who repeatedly experiences themselves as powerless stops recognizing situations where agency is available. A person who repeatedly experiences themselves as emotionally unsafe begins perceiving vulnerability as inherently threatening. The system no longer evaluates each situation independently. It predicts experience through the framework built by repetition. And because prediction influences attention, emotion, and interpretation automatically, the familiar identity keeps reproducing itself through perception before conscious reasoning fully engages. The person then experiences the resulting reality as confirmation that the identity was accurate all along. But much of the confirmation was generated by the system's own repeated expectations, filtering what became emotionally visible in the first place. The attachment to identity becomes especially strong when suffering itself starts providing structure. Emotional pain can create organization inside the mind, because repeated suffering gives the nervous system something predictable to orient around. A person who repeatedly experiences anxiety may unconsciously organize life around managing threat. A person who repeatedly experiences loneliness may organize attention around rejection and emotional distance. These patterns create psychological direction even when they create distress. The suffering becomes familiar enough to function as an organizing principle. This creates a disturbing dynamic where removing the suffering can initially produce emptiness rather than relief. The system loses a familiar source of emotional structure. Without the repeated problem, the identity built around managing the problem temporarily loses coherence. This is one reason people sometimes recreate difficulties after periods of stability. The nervous system is not consciously seeking pain. It is seeking recognizable organization. Familiar suffering provides continuity. Unfamiliar peace may initially feel psychologically undefined. The mind then begins reactivating old emotional patterns because those patterns restore a known structure the system already understands how to navigate. Time strengthens these patterns because repeated identity structures become increasingly integrated into memory, prediction, and expectation simultaneously. The longer a pattern repeats, the more the past becomes reorganized around it, the more the future becomes predicted through it, and the more the present becomes interpreted according to it. This creates a closed psychological system where identity feels historically confirmed, emotionally familiar, and predictively stable all at once. The person no longer experiences the pattern as something learned gradually. They experience it as something permanent that has always existed. But permanence is often just long-term reinforcement becoming invisible. The system compresses years of repeated emotional experience into the simplified conclusion that this is who I am. That conclusion then shapes future behavior automatically because the nervous system trusts established continuity more than uncertain alternatives. Over time, the identity structure becomes self-sustaining because every layer of experience begins reinforcing the same repeated pattern simultaneously. Memory confirms it. Emotion reinforces it. Attention prioritizes it. Prediction expects it. Social interaction stabilizes it. The result is a psychological environment where remaining the same begins feeling inevitable, even though the identity itself was constructed gradually through repetition over time. What makes this difficult to recognize is that the system hides adaptation beneath authenticity. The mind does not announce that it is reinforcing patterns through familiarity and repetition. It presents the final structure as personality, preference, instinct, or truth. The repeated pathway becomes so efficient that it stops feeling learned. It feels immediate. This creates the illusion that the familiar self is the original self rather than the practiced self. But many aspects of identity are maintained through constant unconscious rehearsal. Emotional reactions, attentional habits, interpretations, coping mechanisms, relational dynamics, even self-worth are repeatedly regenerated every day through reinforcement loops operating beneath awareness. The person then mistakes the stability of the pattern for evidence that the pattern is fundamental. In reality, the pattern may simply be the most rehearsed structure inside the system. The nervous system becomes attached not because the identity is objectively true, but because repetition reduced uncertainty around it, enough for the system to depend on it psychologically. The shift begins when familiarity stops being mistaken for truth. You start recognizing that repeated emotional states, repeated narratives, and repeated behaviors feel authentic, largely because the system practiced them long enough to remove resistance around them. This changes the meaning of change completely. The discomfort of becoming different no longer appears as evidence that the new pattern is false. It becomes evidence that the nervous system has not fully adapted to it yet. The familiar identity loses some of its authority once repetition itself becomes visible as the mechanism maintaining it. Thoughts still appear automatically. Emotional patterns still return. Familiar reactions still feel immediate, but they no longer feel unquestionably definitive. You begin seeing that the self is not a fixed object hidden underneath experience. It is a continuously reinforced structure shaped by what the mind repeatedly returns to over time. And once that becomes visible, identity stops appearing completely permanent. It begins appearing adaptive, maintained through repetition rather than revealed as absolute truth from the beginning.